The racist policeman accidentally stopped an officer and started shouting at him without knowing his mistake. When he came to know the truth, he was shocked. The sun was beginning its graceful descent over the streets of Sacramento, casting long shadows and painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter navigated his sedan through this picturesque scene, the hum of his engine a soft backdrop to the fading day. The radio played faintly, a soothing antidote to the bustling city streets he had just navigated. As he approached a yellow light, slowing down as it turned red, the tranquility of his journey was abruptly interrupted by the sharp blare of a police siren. Blue and red lights erupted behind him, and Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, his brows furrowing slightly. Pulling over to the side of the road, he rolled down his window as a police cruiser parked behind him. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Larson adjusted his belt as he swaggered toward Eric's car, exuding the confidence of someone used to being in control. "License and registration," Larson said curtly, his voice flat but laced with authority. Eric complied without a word, reaching into his glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, yet he could feel Larson's gaze scrutinizing him, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned but nodded slightly. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric more closely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore, at least not for Larson. His posture shifted subtly but noticeably, as if he had already decided this was more than a minor infraction. As Larson continued to scrutinize Eric, his demeanor shifted from professional detachment to something more probing, almost predatory. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked, his tone sharpening with each syllable. Eric hesitated, sensing the undercurrent of suspicion. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license," he replied, maintaining his calm exterior. Yet, Larson seemed uninterested in the details, his questions veering off into territories far removed from traffic laws. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson pressed, his voice now edged with an accusatory tone that suggested he was no longer concerned with a simple traffic violation. Eric's calmness only fueled Larson's growing frustration. "Just going home," Eric responded, his voice steady, betraying no hint of anxiety. But the tension was palpable, hanging thick in the air between them. Larson leaned in closer, his scrutiny intensifying. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" he challenged, his voice hardening with each word. Eric let the silence stretch momentarily before replying, "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson scoffed but did not reply immediately. Instead, he began pacing a small circle in front of the car, visibly unsettled by Eric's composure. Most people would have shown signs of nervousness or fear by now, but Eric stood tall, his demeanor unthreatening yet resolute. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered, almost to himself, as if trying to grasp what made Eric so different. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is," Eric countered, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. This response left Larson momentarily speechless, his usual authoritative stance faltering under the weight of Eric's quiet poise. The dynamic was shifting, and Larson, accustomed to controlling these interactions, found himself on uncertain ground. Yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down, determined to assert his dominance. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson commanded, his voice clipped, betraying his rising frustration. Eric raised an eyebrow but complied silently, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As Larson patted him down, his hands lingering longer than necessary, it became clear this was less about procedure and more about power. But Eric, unfazed, remained a picture of calm, his composure unbroken even as Larson's search yielded nothing incriminating. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Eric, calm, composed, and unsettlingly poised. His gaze flicked back to the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet manufactured. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson repeated, his voice clipped, betraying his need to stay in control. Eric raised an eyebrow, incredulous but still measured. "Weapons," he echoed. His tone incredulous but controlled. Larson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his composure cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again," he snapped. Eric hesitated, a flicker of unreadable emotion passing across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Larson approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt breaking the uneasy silence. The officer patted Eric down in quick, rough movements, his hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, as though he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done, I'm not done." Larson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to maintain control. Eric folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension between them. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "So, you a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly. "Or something?" The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Larson further. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me, think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson took the bait. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always." He stopped himself abruptly, the words lingering like smoke even though they hadn't fully escaped. Eric's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. "People like me," Eric repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Larson bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. "I think I do," Eric replied quietly. His calmness wasn't passive anymore, it was razor sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as though he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Larsen was on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larsen's brows knitted together, irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though a faint crack in his tone betrayed otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larsen's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, laden with unspoken implications. Larsen's eyes followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," Eric said, his tone casual, as if introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larsen froze, his eyes darting from the badge to Eric's face, searching for any sign that this might be a joke. There was none, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larsen repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Eric interrupted, saving him the trouble of finishing the thought. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Larsen's face paled, his confident demeanor unraveling in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Eric closed the gap Larsen had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larsen?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larsen didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, "though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assume that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold." "Why?" Larsen started, opening his mouth but finding no words. Eric finished the thought for him, his words carrying the weight of an indictment. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." Larsen's shoulders sagged slightly, the full weight of Eric's words landing squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if it might somehow disappear if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larsen a moment to breathe, but his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larsen's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation cost him. "And you're going to hear from me again," Eric added, his voice lowering slightly. "Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larsen swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. He looked over his shoulder, meeting Larsen's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larsen," he said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larsen was left standing in the fading light, his confidence shaken and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but Eric's mind was anything but. The encounter replayed in his head not because it was unique, but precisely because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file sat open in front of him, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless: minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, as he thought about the broader implications. Larson wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. And Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. If there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally quietly." Eric leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "And that's the problem. Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" Eric didn't hesitate. "A department-wide review, not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Eric's response was simple but firm. "Good. It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports as Eric worked tirelessly to compile data, speak with officers, and hold public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Officers, once dismissive of internal reviews, found themselves under intense scrutiny, their actions dissected not just by Eric but by panels comprising community leaders, legal experts, and even former officers who had left the force disillusioned. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, painted a clearer picture of systemic issues that had festered unchecked for years. For Larson, the consequences were immediate and unavoidable. Facing an internal hearing, he squirmed under Eric's unwavering gaze, the weight of accountability pressing down on him like never before. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings, his presence a constant reminder of the power dynamics now reversed. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson, it was in preventing the next Larson. The case became a cornerstone of the department's reform efforts, cited in training sessions as an example of how unchecked biases could escalate into career-defining mistakes. Meanwhile, Eric spearheaded initiatives aimed at reshaping the department's culture. New training modules emphasized de-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, and community engagement. Protocols for traffic stops and other interactions were rewritten to prioritize transparency and accountability. Officers were encouraged to attend town hall meetings, where they faced tough questions from residents and shared their perspectives in turn. These measures weren't universally welcomed. Some officers grumbled about being treated like suspects, while others resisted changes they saw as undermining their authority. But Eric remained steadfast, knowing that meaningful reform required discomfort. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Eric's actions began to manifest. Complaints against officers dropped significantly, and surveys showed a marked improvement in public trust. Community members who had once viewed the police with suspicion now spoke of renewed hope. Even within the department, attitudes began to shift. Younger officers embraced the reforms, seeing them as opportunities to redefine their roles in society. Veterans, initially resistant, started to acknowledge the value of accountability not as punishment, but as a path to legitimacy. By the time Eric stood at the podium of a community event addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents, the atmosphere was electric with cautious optimism. He spoke not of blame but of responsibility, emphasizing the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, Eric declared, his voice resonating through the hall. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here together. The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. As Eric stepped away from the podium, the echoes of applause still reverberating through the hall, he paused for a moment, allowing himself to absorb the significance of the evening. The faces in the crowd reflected a spectrum of emotions: hope, skepticism, determination, all united by a shared desire for change. Eric knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also understood that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward justice. This moment wasn't just about him or even about Larson, it was about laying the groundwork for a future where accountability and respect were the cornerstones of law enforcement. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let us start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right. Together, we can build a world where the badge truly represents integrity, fairness, and respect for all.